right, hello folks. Today's demonstration is going to be on a theme. It's a Mediterranean theme of pasta, pesto, and pizza is what we're calling this theme today. And for that, I've got the equipment list that you'll have on one of your sheets that you'll download, and it has all the supplies that you need to work with. If you don't have the right size skillet, use a skillet that's going to be adequate for either the sauce pot or the skillet. If you have the utensils that are on the list, wonderful. If you don't have all the same things that I have here, feel free to improvise to the best of your ability. If you're not sure, there's a Q&A session right after the demo that you'll be able to ask questions to either myself or one of the interns to be able to explain some of those principles. I'm going to start today with the flatbread. And before I start the flatbread, I'm going to use this food processor. And you may have a food processor at home, maybe you don't. But what I'm going to do is start with sweet basil. Now, each of your kits that you have, your home edition of the kit has a package of basil, sweet basil. From that, I broke it out into two sections. I took a few leaves and I separated those out for the sweet basil for the Pappardelle pasta dish. So from that large one-size bundle, you're going to pull out a few of those. If you want to save a top for the process, feel free to do so. But I'm going to start in the food processor, the walnuts that we have there for the pesto and the garlic. Those two items, along with about half of the oil, I'm going to start and spin. Power outage. Must have been from the rain. Son of a nutcracker. There we go. And I want to let those pulse a bit, or just let it run to be able to start breaking up those nuts so it gets to be kind of creamy and smooth. Behind that, I'm going to put in the Parmesan cheese and all the sweet basil. Some of those larger stems, no worries. Those will puree in this food processor quite nicely. The fresh smell of sweet basil is one of those that are very indigenous to the Italian cuisine. And you'll notice that a lot. Kind of work them down in there a bit. Cap back on. I'm going to pulse. Allow that to run so you can start to see the green develop and the actual smooth pesto that we're familiar with. We typically buy at the store. Take your spatula, wipe down the sides of the bowl to make sure you've got all the ingredients that just through centrifugal force themselves over to the walls of the machine. And then you're going to pull one of the feed tubes out and let it run and pour in the balance of the oil. And that's going to give it a very smooth and creamy consistency. A little bit of pepper, I think, is a good option. I'm not a big fan of putting more salt in it, largely due to the fact that the Parmesan is already salty just through the aging process. It reduces the amount of moisture in that cheese as it ages, and it makes it a little salty. So that's a choice you may want to make before you add salt to this pesto. But getting it smooth and pureed is going to make a big impact on the flavor and how it hits the palate. Pesto basically is from Genoa, Italy. And it is a dynamic flavor a lot of us are used to, but not a lot of us are used to having it in a fresh state. Typically we buy it from the grocery store that doesn't have the nice fresh smell of sweet basil and oregano, garlic, all those wonderful flavors that come along with that. Next step I'm going to do is to prepare the flatbread, of which you have a portion of dough that's already been proofed And with that, we're going to use some of the flour that's in your cart, and we're going to lightly dust it on both sides just to keep it from sticking. Now, if you don't have a rolling pin, you can use a wine bottle or some other cylinder type item to work with to be able to get that to roll. Here we have a little handheld rolling pin that I'm going to use just to be able to move the dough. You could do that by hand, very much like they do in Manhattan. You see those in the windows. At some of the pizzerias, the dough is just simply pulled and stretched by hand. Doesn't have to have this roller. I use the roller just for the simplicity and to be able to expedite the process of making the flatbread. How thick do I roll it? It really depends on how you like your pizza or your flatbread, so that it's not too terribly thick, not too terribly thin. You want the dough to cook while the ingredients start to melt down. A little flour on top is needed based on how you roll that out. Meanwhile, I have the water heavily salted for our Pappardelle pasta dish. And then you're going to have a half sheet tray. And with that half sheet tray on your package that you have for the pizza, the flatbread, you've got some olive oil. Spread that olive oil on the reverse side of a tray, and then sprinkle it with a small amount of cornmeal. The cornmeal will allow it to keep from sticking. And then you'll simply take that pizza dough and drop it right on that cornmeal. At that point, you can spread it out a little bit further if you wish. And from there, we're going to put on our pesto. This is a white pizza, which is why we're using pesto. Sometimes you see folks will use a bechamel sauce or a white sauce or sort of a kind of an Alfredo sauce. I see that a lot on pizzas as an option, as a topping. It just depends on what your preference is. I really like the flavor of pesto. I think it's wonderful. You can go all the way to the edge, or you can leave a little crust around the outside. Your preference is how that's going to work. So that's your base on that flatbread. Behind that, we're going to put in the toppings. The toppings that I have set up for you today are going to be some shredded aged mozzarella. I'm going to put that kind of evenly around the pesto. And then behind that, I'm going to put slices of fresh mozzarella. The pieces that you have here are rather large, so you can feel free to break those up. And that will give you some distribution. You have enough there to make 2 flatbreads. So use your portions appropriately so you have enough to be able to craft 2, 1 per person. Behind that, we're going to go with some slices of tomato, which are already sliced for you. Present those evenly so that it has a good visual when it comes out of the oven. I try to avoid the middle so I can have those nice clean slices and not having that set up accordingly. I'm going to put some mixed herbs, Italian herbs, basil, oregano, marjoram, thyme, and what those consist of. I'm going to put in a little bit of chopped parsley. You got to divide that between the two, give it a little bit of flavor. And then we have sliced rosemary roasted chicken. It's going to go on the flatbread however you wish. If you opt out on the chicken, no worries. More for somebody else. And if top it again with a little bit of shredded mozzarella, trying to keep not too much ingredient on the sheet tray itself. And then we're going to finish that with some grated Parmesan. Now I've got the oven preset for 348 degrees here in the instructional kitchen. If I was at home, I would have a 450 oven based on how that oven works for you. And that's ready to go in the oven. You could mill some pepper on there, but I think we have enough pepper from the pesto that it's not needed. You can set the timer according to your recipe. That's up to you. I'd rather just watch it than to be annoyed by another alarm. Enough alarms in our lives as it is. Don't want another one. It's kind of stresses you out. Stresses me out to hear that alarm going all the time. So I'm going to move on to the pasta dish while the flatbread's working. clean as I go, get all the stuff off my station so I can stay nice and neat. I typically start out with some wet towels that have been put into a sanitation solution, and at home, the sanitation solution I would use would be vinegar and water, usually about a tablespoon per gallon, and that'll take care of reducing some of the pathogen growth on items like that. So I'm going to have a skillet, 10-12 inch. This one I have here is a 12-inch skillet, and allow it to get hot. And you have butter. I'm going to divide it into two parts. So one of the parts of butter I'm going to go into that skillet, and as the heat transfers into that skillet, that butter is going to melt. Meanwhile, I have the boiling sea salt water cooking pretty hard, so it's coming to what I would consider a rapid boil is what we can see here, is that water is rolling along pretty well, and that's going to allow that pappardelle pasta to cook relatively quickly. So as that butter melts and we start to pick up an aromatic that smells kind of toasty, almost like buttered popcorn, that smell we're going to get, that's from allowing the butter to brown briefly, and that's what we want to have for that. So control the heat. The heat is going to make a big impact on how fast these products are going to cook. So the items that are going to go into that skillet next are going to be the chopped shallot. It's going to go in there, and a wood spoon or a spatula is going to be a good tool to work with to move that shallot around. The smell of shallot's a little sharper than an onion, a little bit more intense in flavor, but it delivers a real nice nose, really good smell to it. And I want to cook them, not to caramelize them, but just to get them to become translucent, the point where there's kind of see-through. As that finishes, I'm going to put in the chopped garlic. While that's working, I'm going to put in the pasta dough, allow that to cook. Once the garlic goes in, move along with it relatively quickly so you don't lose the refined smell of the garlic. You want it to smell sweet. Mill a little pepper into the skillet so it warms up a little bit, and then you're going to drop in your white wine. And you're going to allow that white wine to reduce to where it's what we would call in the French term au sec, or almost dry. We're going to let that cook down almost dry. Now the pappardelle pasta you've got is a fresh pasta, and I'll always pull it apart to make sure none of these noodle pieces stick together. So I want them to be able to cook freely and to move along comfortably in the water as the water is moving into a rapid boil. So if I have them stuck together, we're going to have pieces of pasta that are stuck together, and they won't cook correctly. So that's important, to be able to take one of the trays and put it onto a clean table with some single-use towels, whatever you want to use to be able to separate these noodles so that they are all free agents to cook in that boiling salted water. Pasta goes in the water. Because it's fresh pasta, it's going to become al dente relatively quickly. As that wine reduces down to an au sec, we're going to put in the mushrooms and allow the mushrooms to cook, allowing those mushrooms to cook with a little bit of the wine to be able to help extract some of the natural water that's in the mushroom. We know that we salted the water for the pasta, and that's going to have some impact on the flavor of the dish, but it's not going to be tremendous. So I'm going to put a little milled salt in the skillet for the pasta. Kosher salt, table salt you have at home, any of that type of product will work. These recipes could be used over and over again. Just a matter of going to the grocer, buying the right stuff to be able to make these dishes. They're all designed to be replicated at any point in time based on the ingredients that you buy. For the pasta, shortly after I put it in the water, I want to move it around a little bit, just so I know that they're not going to stick together as the water comes back to a boil and gives me the liberties to be able to get that noodle cooked. Now, unlike dry pasta, This fresh pasta is going to cook in less than half the amount of time, about a quarter amount of the time. This is already a fresh pasta. Doesn't take long at all. So with that being said, well, that pasta becomes, you can see that it turns kind of a beautiful white color, and it looks al dente because it isn't fully cooked, but it's nice and soft and smooth. At that point, I'm going to put in the pieces of asparagus, which I simply cut them into small pieces so that I can put those in that same water that the pasta is boiling in, just for the purpose of simplifying the dish. I have some chopped parsley, butter, a little bit of sweet basil that I reserved, and one of the basil tops for garnish. I'm going to move around these mushrooms a little bit. I'm going to reduce the heat just briefly. Pull that off the fire. We'll let that cool down a little bit. The residual heat, otherwise known as the carryover heat, is going to finish cooking those mushrooms off. Now, based on how dense or crunchy you want your asparagus to be, will determine how long you're going to allow that asparagus to cook in that water with the pasta. To me, I want it to have a little bit of a bite to it and not off color and not mushy. That's going to make a difference on the finished dish. Now we're going to strain this pasta, and I want you to save a little bit of the pasta water to be able to fortify this skillet dish. So I'm going to drain off the asparagus and the noodle. I'm going to save a little bit of the cooking water for use in the dish as needed. It doesn't have to go into it. I just like it to be a little bit saucier, and I want to use this natural pasta water. A lot of times when I'm cooking pasta, say at home, I will very likely save that water to be able to blanch vegetables in and use it as another, instead of having to put just straight up water on the fire. I've got that lovely flavored pasta water. It's got a little bit of starch in it, so it tastes good. So I'm adding a little bit of that cooking liquid to the skillet. Turn the heat back up. But again, control the heat because it's going to be high, and you want to be able to manage it. At that point, I'm going to put in half of the Parmesan cheese and let that melt down, make somewhat of a creamy sauce out of that. It's going to soften up and become a little bit viscous, a little bit thicker. And I'm going to put in the parsley, majority of it. It's going to go in there. Save a little bit back behind. I'll let that cook, and I've got kind of a sauce developed there. At this point, I'm going to put in the remainder of the butter and allow that butter to kind of thicken up that sauce a bit. Now the flatbread, what I do to cook that is I cook it by eye until I get it to the degree of doneness that I want it to be. So I want the top cheeses to be nice and golden and brown in color, and I want the dough to be well risen and it to look very inviting, very much like a pizzeria. So I just simply open the oven because visually it looks wonderful. So I'm going to take these drained noodles and asparagus, put them together in the dish, move those around in that succulent sauce that we have. These noodles are going to take up a little bit of that succulent sauce that we've made. And so that's where that reserved cooking liquid comes into play, to be able to make that a little bit saucier and allow us the liberties of having those noodles coated with the sauce in the pan. You can't take it away once it goes in there, so be conscientious of that. The basil leaves that you reserve back, stack them up, simply tear them so that you get those flavors in there. Not too early because you want it to be fresh and taste dynamic. You put them in there too early, they're going to cook too fast, and they're not going to have a wonderful flavor to them. So we want those noodles to be well coated, distribute the mushrooms, the asparagus, the flavorful sauce all around them. And I'm going to put in a little bit more of the parm, move that around in the dish, And we're pretty much ready to serve this. So this could be a meal for one night, where the flatbread could be a meal or a lunch for another day, based on your classes, whether they're all online or maybe you've got them jobs, whatever that might be. You've got an opportunity to maybe make a couple of meals, and it warms up quite nicely. So for this particular dish, I'm going to use a family style bowl. I'm simply going to take the pasta and present it in the middle of the bowl. And you can see that nice sauce enrobes the pasta quite nicely. And to finish that off, I'm going to sprinkle the remaining Parmesan cheese over the top. And then I have a nice sprig of sweet basil that I reserve back just to use as a garnish for the dish. And if I have anything hitting the sides, clean sanitized towel to wipe the sides of the dish down. And that's that pasta dish. Pasta pappardelle is what that would be. And then to finish our class for today, I'm just going to cut that flatbread. Having a cutting board, either a knife, or I think the pizza wheel is probably a little bit safer for some of us. It just depends on what our preferences are. Take that pizza out of the oven. You allow it to rest for a minute or two, which is why I opened up that oven a little bit earlier. And then if you need to, you can use the spatula to help release it. But for the most part, if we had enough oil and cornmeal on the tray, it should slide right off of there nice and smoothly for you. And because we've allowed it to rest, we can just basically start to cut it. If you don't allow it to rest, cheese is going to run. It's going to make a little bit of a mess. You can cut either New York wedges, or you can cut Ohio squares, whatever you want to do based on your preferences. I'm going to cut these in wedges. That's what our interns have for lunch. And then simply just platter it up, slide it right off of there onto the serving dish. Oops, getting it on the dish. And then if you have any parsley left over from the cooking process, that can be finished off on there. If you want to save some of your basil and that kind of stuff to be able to make all these dishes nice and pretty, feel free to do so. But that's the pasta, pizza, and pesto for today's OUAB. Thank you very much.